Greetings to our audience and our panelists from Kabul. I welcome you all to today's discussion on peace building in Afghanistan. I am Nipa Banerjee with the School of International Development and Global Studies and the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. My research focus is on development cooperation in South Asia and in development, reconstruction, and peace building in conflict states, especially Afghanistan, where I served as the head of Canada's aid program in the period 2002 to 2006. As for today's agenda, we present to you three experts from Afghanistan, whom today's moderator, Dr. Stephen Barani, will introduce in a few minutes. A Q&A period will follow the panelists' presentation, chaired by the moderator. Today's discussion will focus on two required pillars of a broad-based, comprehensive peace process: participation of women and the civil society in the Afghanistan peace process. Peace agreements and conflict prevention often fail due to a lack of popular support. Therefore, the need to reach beyond the armed and government actors and include civil society in peace building and conflict prevention has been recognized as critical. Also of particular significance in Afghanistan is the participation of women in the peace process. Women are not just victims, but vital actors in reconciliation and the construction of a peaceful society. It is just not possible to have peace without the support of 50% of the population. Our panelists, Dr. Ahmadzai, Dr. Akseer, and Dr. Partho, will throw light on some of these issues. The panel moderator, Dr. Stephen Barani, a professor with the School of International Development and Global Studies, will introduce the panel. Dr. Barani's work focuses on development and security, the challenges of security sector reforms, development cooperation, gender equality, and persons with disability in fragile and conflict-affected areas, especially Haiti. He has vast practicing experience with various governmental, non-governmental, and research institutions in Canada, Central America, the Caribbean, and Europe. He has a whole array of publication on peace building and development in fragile and conflict-affected states and on Canadian policy stance in these areas. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Nipa, for that overly generous introduction, and welcome to you all. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you our main panelists. So first, the Asia Foundation's country representative to Afghanistan, Mr. Abdullah Ahmadzai, as well as Dr. Tabasum Akseer, who is Director of Policy Research at the Foundation in Afghanistan. Together, they will speak to the perceptions of the Afghan people on peace, the extent to which they see peace as achievable, the red lines that are meant not to be crossed from their perception, from their perspective in the peace negotiations, what concessions Afghans are willing to make in the interests of peace, as well as relative gender, or relevant gender dimensions, of course, that are very much at the heart of these talks for the parties and for civil society or networks, as we shall see. They're also of great interest to Canada. Their observations will draw from the Asian Foundation's Afghanistan flash surveys, which provide data from all 34 of Afghanistan's province, tracked over 5 months from September 20 to January 2021. Now, as my colleague Nipa Banerjee noted, Sustainable peace requires national ownership, which in turn requires an inclusive peace process and multi-sectoral policy dialogue beyond the warring parties. Civil society-driven initiatives for peace create space for such inclusive and endogenous dialogue. The Afghanistan Public Policy Research Organization, or APRO, and the National Advocacy Committee for Public Policy held a series of open forums for peace beginning in July of 2019. In his presentation, Dr. Saeed Parto, the Director of Research at APRO, will provide an overview of those forums' findings and conclusions. Towards the end, he will invite webinar participants to share their thoughts on and insights into what might be an inclusive and realistic framework for peace in Afghanistan. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass the mic, so to speak, to Dr. Abdullah Ahmadzai and then to Dr. Tabasum Akseer of the Asia Foundation in Kabul.
Thank you very much, Stephen. First of all, on behalf of the Asia Foundation, I'd like to extend my appreciations to CIPS for organizing this important event as an opportunity for us to be able to share public perceptions about peace in Afghanistan, and also a number of other issues with regards to basic rights and women's participation in rights in the peace process, but also a little bit about COVID. I'm going to share the presentation now. So just as a background, before we enter into the presentation itself, flash surveys came at the right time in 2020 as an idea within our team when peace process was basically the buzzword in Afghanistan. And in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously our main survey, which is our flagship program, Survey of the Afghan People, which involves face-to-face interviews in 34 provinces of the country, was not feasible due to the high risks that it posed to the people and also to our staff and enumerators. So this was, so to say, to our Survey of the Afghan People, which is more comprehensive, but this one was more focused primarily on understanding public views and concerns about peace, and also how COVID-19 had impacted people's lives in various areas. Just to give you a little bit of background again on the flash surveys, these are telephone interviews, and it's a series of 3 surveys that will be conducted during the course of 6 months. The findings that we will be presenting will only be about the phase 1 of the survey. Phase 2 has also been completed, but it's still at a stage of being analyzed. Once that report is available, we would be happy to present that in a similar forum again to you. Just to provide a bit of context as to the time when the data collection for our survey took place, what were the possible contributing factors that shaped public opinion in 2020. So before the survey data collection began, which was between early September and early October, from September 6th to October 4th, basically. Before that, in February, as we all know, the first reported cases of COVID-19 took place from Herat province, which borders Turkmenistan and Iran. Also, in February, the Doha Agreement was signed between the US and the Taliban in Qatar, Doha of Qatar. In March, we had the early spread of COVID-19. where the first death was reported in the country. And that caused fear amongst our refugees in Iran and Pakistan, who started returning to Afghanistan in mass numbers. I think around 150,000 of those refugee returnees returned to Afghanistan only in the month of March. There was also the international funding and aid and fight COVID-19, including announcements made by the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, IMF, WHO, SARC, and others. So the National Aid Distribution Program was also announced, which had created some level of optimism. In April, the temporary border closures took place between Afghanistan and its neighboring countries, which had a short-term impact on price hikes of goods and commodities in the country. In August, we also saw a ceasefire that was observed during the 3 days of Eid, and also the release of the start of the Taliban prisoner release began. Obviously, because of the COVID-19, temporary business closures also took place in the country. And in September, this was just before the data collection began. The intra-Afghan negotiations also were announced and began. Also, by September, the number of reported cases of COVID-19 reached around 39,000, I think. And some of the developments that took place, which may not have been captured in our survey findings, those were the developments around regional consensus building, which had started by the Afghan government, led by the Dr. Abdullah, who is the head of the National Reconciliation Council. Also, the Geneva Conference, which took place in November 2020, is not something that was covered in media ahead of our data collection process. And then negotiations were ongoing, but they were not necessarily ongoing when the data collection was happening. Also, the level of violence in the country remained unchanged, and following the data collection, we have not seen much reduction in violence. So the way Dr. Akseer will present the key findings from our survey is that first she will talk a little bit about the methodology, the methods, and then some of the findings, the public perceptions about the impact of COVID-19 on their daily lives. And then a few findings that she will share with you about economy, public perception about economy, and obviously, last but most important one, related to peace. How people see peace, what are the red lines for them, as Stephen mentioned, what are some of the concessions that people in Afghanistan are prepared to give in order to ensure that peace negotiations are successful with the Taliban. There are also some additional sections on security and women's rights, and then some of the interwoven themes that relate to demographics that Tabasum will talk about, and some of the regional breakdowns of the findings, just to understand how these trends translate nationally, but also at the regional and provincial level. So I will hand over now to Dr. Akseer to start presenting the key findings, beginning with the methods.
Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you, Stephen and Nipa, for the wonderful introduction. It's great to be here, and thank you everyone for being here. So as Abdullah mentioned, I'll very briefly talk a little bit about the methods for the flash survey data. This survey is very different from our annual survey of the Afghan people, where one is an in-person survey, this is a telephone survey. So there are some limitations that I'll talk about later. But first, I want to talk about sample size and coverage. So the data that I'll share with you has is of interviews with 4,300 Afghans across the country. All of our respondents are over the age of 18. All of our respondents are over the age of 18. Our data initially when collected was 72% male and 28% female. We did weigh this so that it could be 50-50. So it is representative of men and women. The margin of error on the data is plus minus 2.1%. So what this means is if you see differences within that margin, they're not statistically significant. However, they will give you some indication of the direction that a trend or that findings might be heading in. Coverage, this wave is all 34 provinces, as Stephen mentioned earlier. All major ethnic groups are represented, and the sample size is also representative of urban and rural populations. The achieved sample was somewhat skewed towards urban, but we did weigh this so that it could be 26% urban and 74% rural. These are consistent with government estimates on the urban and rural populations. Before I get into the findings, I want to talk about the limitations of the methodology. It's important to think about limitations as well as strengths. When you use random digit dialing, you essentially have a pool of participants where anyone can be called. So in theory, anyone with a cell phone in the country could be contacted. We relied on a team of over 90 enumerators to do the contacting for us. They all work safely from home or from an office where they were all socially distanced. Although it is technically an unbiased way of collecting data, the biases are sort of in its design. You're really only calling people with a cell phone. So with the frequent cell phone tower disruptions, you may be limited to respondents in certain geographic areas. You may also experience a lower response rate because of the unwillingness of some participants to speak with a complete stranger over the phone, particularly when we're asking sensitive questions. However, despite these limitations, telephone surveys continue to be a promising and emerging method for population level data collection in lower to middle income countries. So these are still probably the most viable way of collecting data during a pandemic. So I'll jump right now into data collection, how we did this. 90 enumerators, and the enumerators are gender matched to participants. So men interview men and women interview women. The interviews are each about 33 minutes long. Some of the interviews were around 2 hours long. So that kind of spoke to the willingness of participants, people we randomly dialed, their willingness to speak to a complete stranger. We do assume a position of distrust with our field team. So we rely on a team of independent third-party monitors who review a randomly selected proportion of the completed calls, and they review these for just quality control. They ensure that the enumerator during the process of data collection followed our instruments and asked our questions the way that we had trained them to do so. Once we receive the data, we rely on a series of logic tests to then help us get rid of any inconsistencies, patterns, or duplicates that might exist in the data. So overall, when we think about the various quality control mechanisms, we lost about 3.7%, or we nullified 3.7% of our interviews just because they failed to meet quality control. So moving to our findings on COVID-19. This was one of the three main areas that we're interested in. We wanted to know from Afghans whether or not they were worried about certain activities. We found that Afghans are quite worried at the time or so about engaging in or about visiting a healthcare facility. They're also quite worried about attending school, attending funerals and religious functions, even traveling outside of the home, and engaging in community activities. We also wanted to know from Afghans whether or not they engaged in or they used various precautionary measures for COVID. Majority of participants said that they were frequently washing their hands, they're using soap and other detergents, face masks, social distancing, hand sanitizer, and so on. The least likely measure that they used was other personal protection equipment, so gowns or face shields. And that just might be because of their availability or lack thereof in the country. We also wanted to know the main source of news and information related to COVID. And similar to our survey of the Afghan people data, family and friends continue to be the most frequently referenced source of news and information. This is followed by television, and then it's followed by doctors and healthcare professionals. Social media is also an interesting response here. It's the fourth most common response amongst Afghans. And of course, when you look at these respondents more closer, you see that they're mostly the urban respondents who have access to smartphones, frequent internet, and so on. Radio is also commonly cited. When you look more closely at who's saying radio, you also find that consistent with our survey of the Afghan people data. Radio is most commonly used by respondents in the rural areas. Newspaper was cited by 30% of overall respondents as a main source of news and information related to COVID. We also asked Afghans whether or not the information that they've received is adequate. At the national level, 85% of Afghans said, yes, the information we're receiving is accurate. And when we break this across regions, we see that there are differences. For example, the strongest percentage or the highest percentage of respondents who said that they're satisfied or that the information that they have is adequate is in the East with 90%. This is compared to the lowest of 75% reported in the Northwest. We also wanted to know whether or not Afghans are the type of information that they're receiving from the government. So we asked, are you, in response to COVID, has the government provided you with timely information, accurate information, or even just support to you and your family? Interestingly, the same percentages of respondents answered for having received timely and accurate information. 63% said yes to a great or moderate extent. This is only 17% when we ask about whether or not they've received support, whether they or their families have received support during the pandemic. We wanted to know, keep in mind this is back in September, whether or not anyone in their family had received a confirmed COVID diagnosis. At the national level, 23% of Afghans said yes, they or someone in their household had received a positive COVID diagnosis. When we look across this question regionally, we see there are stark differences. In the Southeast is where the lowest positive COVID diagnoses were reported, which was 15%, and the highest were reported in the East and in the West at 30% each. We also wanted to know about the stigma associated with COVID. So we asked, would you or your family, or would you associate with someone who previously had COVID but is now healthy? At the national level, almost half of respondents said yes, they would associate with somebody who previously had COVID but is now healthy. When we look at this response more closely, we see that men are more likely than women to say that they would associate with someone who had COVID but is now healthy. We also find interesting regional variances. Respondents in the East are more likely to say that they would associate with someone than those in the Northwest. There's no differences amongst urban and rural respondents, and those with formal education are increasingly more likely to say that they would associate with someone who had COVID but is not healthy than those with no formal education. Older respondents are less likely to say that they wouldn't associate, they're more likely to say that they wouldn't associate with somebody than younger respondents. We also wanted to know from Afghans whether or not they're concerned about the impact of COVID on their personal health. 48% of Afghans said that they're very concerned. And when we look at this question by gender, we see that women are more concerned about the impact of COVID on their personal health than men, 57% compared to 39%. We also see regional variances once again, with respondents in Central Highlands notably more concerned than those in the Southwest. And also there's a relationship with age and concern. Older respondents are more likely to say that they're not concerned at all than younger respondents. When we ask the same question now about the impact of COVID on their lifestyle, we see slight differences. So while 48% are very concerned about the impact on their personal health, 54% are very concerned about the impact on their lifestyle. So their daily routine, their ability to go to work, and their ability to socialize. Women, once again, are more concerned here than men, and respondents in the Central Highlands, again, more concerned than those in the Northwest. There's also a relationship with age. Young people are more likely to be very concerned than those over the age of 55. Moving very briefly to economy. We asked a range of questions on the economic conditions of Afghans, but before we get into those findings, I wanted to share a quick economic profile. 48% of our respondents are engaged in an activity that generates income. This is skewed towards men who are more likely to be involved in an activity that generates an income. There's also regional variances, with respondents in the Southwest more likely to be generating an income or employed than those in the Central Highlands, for example. Average monthly income of Afghans is around $100 a month. And this is just of our sample size, it's not overall. The types of profession that respondents are engaged in are on your screen. I won't read through all of them. And when we look at the relationship between engagement or generating an income and gender, we see that where the average monthly income is lower, women tend to contribute to the overall income in greater proportions. So for example, in Central Highlands, where the average monthly income is only around 11,000 AFs a month, the highest percentage of women in Central Highlands are in Central Highlands who say that they are engaged in an activity that generates income or they have jobs. So similar to our survey of the Afghan people, we asked a series of questions on the financial situation of their household and, economic situation of their household. On your screen is the data for the financial situation of household. We asked, has it gotten better, stayed the same, or has it worsened over the past 12 months? 71% of our participants said that the financial situation had worsened over the past 12 months. 75% said that employment opportunities have worsened over the past 12 months. When we look at the purchasing power of respondents, we see a similar pattern of significant proportions saying that things have worsened. The cost of healthcare services worsened for 63% of our participants. The affordability of goods in the market worsened for 77%, and sadly, the cost of medication worsened for 80% of our respondents. Physical access to healthcare worsened for 47% of respondents. We wanted to know more about the different types of aid that is available to households, especially given the worsening economic system or worsening economic situation that I just shared. So we asked Afghans, we provided a list of different types of aid. We asked, are you aware of this aid? If you are aware of the aid, have you or anyone in your household accessed this aid? And if you did access the aid, was it sufficient for your needs? So when you look at the percentage of respondents who said that they're aware of food, for example, 33% said that they're aware of it. Of that 33%, less than 1/3, so 29%, said that they had accessed this aid. And of that 29%, less than half, 44%, said that it was sufficient for their needs. Similar to our survey of the Afghan people, we also wanted to know about corruption. So we asked, Is corruption a problem in your daily life? Is it major, minor, or not a problem at all? 85% of Afghans said that corruption is a major problem in their daily life. A greater percentage, 95%, said that corruption is a major problem in Afghanistan as a whole. So moving to peace, we wanted to know from Afghans whether or not they think peace is achievable in the next 2 years. At the national level, 54%, more than half of Afghans said yes, peace is achievable. When we looked more closely at the responses, we find that men tend to be more optimistic than women. Rural respondents are also more optimistic than urban respondents, and there's also regional differences, so significant regional differences. So for example, respondents in the East were significantly more optimistic than those in the Central Highlands, the difference of 72% compared to 38%. We also see that optimism increases with age, so respondents aged 55 or over are somewhat more optimistic than those who are between the ages 18 to 25. On the reverse, we see that pessimism increases with education. So Afghans who have no formal education tend to be more optimistic than those who have more than 12 years of education. There's also a positive relationship between optimism and income. Afghans who make between 25 to 40,000 AFs per month are significantly more optimistic than those who make less than 5,000 AFs per month. On your screen, you'll see the regional differences. While I've already shared the regional differences for those who say that peace is achievable, interesting here is also the gray bar that shows respondents, or the proportion of respondents who simply say that they don't know if peace is achievable. The highest proportion of these respondents is in Central Highlands at 18%. And a follow-up question, amongst the 34% of Afghans who say that peace is not achievable, we ask why not. The most common reason for why peace is not achievable varies by region. So for example, in central Kabul, the most common reason is interference by other countries. In the East, the most common reason for why peace is not achievable is because the government and the Taliban are too far apart. So there's more regional differences. I'll just let you have a look at it. I can also share these slides with you following the talk. If you contact Nipa or Stephen, I'll provide these to them and they can send them to you. We also wanted to know whether or not Afghans felt represented in the peace talks. Less than half, 41% of Afghans said that they feel represented. 50% of Afghans don't feel represented. Men are more likely to say that they feel represented than women. Rural respondents are more likely to feel represented than urban. And the sense of representation also increases with age. So older Afghans are more likely to feel represented than younger Afghans. On the reverse, representation decreases with education. So Afghans with no formal education are more likely to say that they feel represented in peace talks than those with more than 12 years of education. And once again, regional differences are notable. Looking at Central Highlands, 67% of Afghans said that they don't feel represented in peace talks. We wanted to know from Afghans what the main priorities for a peace deal, should there be a peace deal, are. At the national level, the most important priority for Afghans is having a strong central government and women's rights. Equality among different groups of people, the current constitution, and civil liberties are also some of the most important priorities for Afghans. The least important priority for Afghans, as reported to us, is the presence of foreign military forces in Afghanistan. We also asked Afghans that, should there be a hypothetical peace deal, how likely would you be to include one that contained these conditions? Afghans are more likely to say that they're willing to accept a peace deal that has blanket amnesty provided to the Taliban fighters, a role in the government given to the Taliban, blanket amnesty for Taliban senior leaders, and Afghans are less willing to support a peace deal where control is ceded, control over certain provinces is ceded to the Taliban. They're also less willing to support a peace deal where women can no longer work outside of the home, or where women and girls can no longer attend school. We wanted to do a range of experiments to help control for this social desirability effect. Social desirability effect in social science research is where a respondent gives you the response that he or she thinks that you want to hear. So there's a little bit of bias in there. So what we did was we split the respondents up into different groups. And for each group, we offered a different version of a hypothetical proposal. So in the proposal on your screen, we said to respondents, this proposal calls for sweeping reform, and the proposal was either endorsed by the Taliban, endorsed by the government, or we just didn't say who it was endorsed by. And then we asked participants, would you support this? So what the data on your screen shows is that a majority of Afghans would say that they would support a proposal if you just didn't mention who it was by. If you said it was just by nobody, 76% said that they would support this hypothetical proposal on reforming the Afghan prison system. This support decreased to 64% as soon as you mentioned the Taliban. And it was about 74% if you mentioned the government. So very little difference between if you mentioned nobody and if you mentioned the government. We did it again with another hypothetical proposal where we said that this one would allow Afghans to vote in direct elections when selecting leaders for district council. Again, we saw that support decreased as soon as you mentioned the Taliban. Only 80% of people said that they would support it if we mentioned the Taliban, and that support increased somewhat to 87% if we said that it was being put forth by the government. That's 7 percentage point difference. To us, it's 7 percentage points. However, some might argue it's a very small difference. Others might argue it's a notable difference. We then ran another experiment where we asked about, we created another hypothetical peace deal, and we randomly generated different conditions. So the 4 conditions on your screen are, participants got 2 versions of it. They also got they either got a condition where the peace deal would allow or not allow the Taliban to have majority influence. Condition 2 was either they were to reduce or increase the role of women. Condition 3 was to either include or exclude the requirement that Islamic law was higher than secular law. And condition 4 was either democratically elect leaders or be an Islamic emirate. So the random peace deal that we generated had any one of these conditions completely randomized. So what we found when we pooled the data was that for condition 1, there's no significant differences when we said that no significant differences with support for this hypothetical peace deal when we said that the Taliban would be allowed to have majority influence. When we looked at condition 4 on the role of women within the peace deal, we saw there's greater support for this peace deal if women had an increased role in public. When we looked at condition 3, whether or not there would be more or less support if Islamic law was included, we found that yes, Afghans are more willing to support a peace deal if Islamic law is included as being higher than secular law. And finally, when we look at condition 4, we found that there's greater support for a hypothetical peace deal if Afghans are able to democratically elect their leaders rather than to be an Islamic emirate. So shifting focus to security, we asked Afghans whether or not the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces are able to provide adequate security without foreign technical assistance. Majority of Afghans said yes, the ANA can. Another majority, 43%, said the ANP can. And we still ask about the Afghan local police, even though this was more recently disbanded. However, there's less support for that, or less confidence in the ALP at 37%. We also gauged perception of the Afghan National Police. 65% said that they would contact the ANP if they needed help. 54% said that, or agreed that the ANP improves security. 51% said the ANP is efficient at arresting criminals, and half said that the ANP is honest and fair with the Afghan people. Similar to our survey of the Afghan people, we ask Afghans whether or not they've experienced an act of violence or a crime during the past 12 months, and findings are again consistent with previous years. Around 16% of Afghans said that they have experienced an act of violence or crime. In a follow-up question, we ask about the type of violence and crime experienced, and there are some differences by gender. Women are more likely to say that they don't know, or perhaps they're unwilling to tell us about the type of violence or crime that they experienced. They're also more likely than men to say that they experienced, or perhaps a family member experienced, murder. Men are more likely to say that they experienced a physical attack or a beating than women, and they're also more likely to say that they experienced militancy or insurgency actions towards them. Moving onwards to data findings on women's rights. We asked Afghans, similar to our survey of the Afghan people, whether or not it's acceptable for women to work in different environments. We find, similar to the survey of the Afghan people, that findings are consistent. There's more support for women working in female-dominant areas. Or more traditional areas, for example, hospital or a clinic, a female-only school, or a private company with only female employees. There's less support for women working in environments where there's gender mixing. So a private company with male and female employees, or an NGO with also male and female employees mixing. We also ask Afghans whether or not women should be engaged in certain leadership positions. Afghans are more likely to say that, or to show support for women in leadership positions that are more closer to home. So there's more support amongst both men and women for women's participation in community development councils and engaging as a governor for a province. However, there's decreased support when Afghans consider women working or running for office or running for president of the country. And this support decreases amongst both men and women. When we look more closely at the slide that I shared 2 sections ago on peace deal, remember when I shared the data on the different priorities for a peace deal, the most important priority tied at number 1 was women's rights. So when we disaggregate that further by region, we see that there's consistent support for women's rights across the country. The range is from 91% to 82%, highest being again in Central Highlands and the lowest in the East. These are all participants who say that it's very, very important to protect women's rights should there be a peace deal. So key trends that we're seeing with our flash surveys. We see a mix of both optimism and we also see pessimism. So in pessimism, we see that there are concerns with access to services, with the government's ability to provide essential services and aid to households during the pandemic. We also see the deteriorating economic situation. 85 to 95% of Afghans are reporting corruption either in their daily lives or in the country. We also see deteriorating access to healthcare and medication and worsening employment conditions. We also note a stigma associated with COVID, or a stigma towards people who had COVID and are now clear. And there's also a link between the reluctance to obtain healthcare and economic uncertainty. On the right side, though, just to end with a positive note, we are seeing satisfaction with the media. We are seeing that the media has become an effective tool in raising awareness for COVID-19. There's also optimism for peace. More than half of our samples say that peace is possible over the next 2 years, and almost half of Afghans say that they feel represented in peace. There are regional differences, however. We also see the importance of protecting democratic values and the importance of protecting women's rights should there be a peace deal. Now, I've mentioned quite a bit about our survey of the Afghan people. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the survey of the Afghan people, it's the longest running longitudinal perception survey in Afghanistan. We're going into our 15th year this year of perception data related to a range of topics from governance, economy, women's rights, service delivery, so on and so forth. As Abdullah mentioned earlier, we're unable to do the survey of the Afghan people this year due to the pandemic. So the alternative was the flash surveys. We adapted some of the questions from the survey of the Afghan people into the flash surveys. So we see some similarities, and we also see some differences. So to begin, we see the impact of the social desirability effect. And a lot of the questions on women's rights, on their access to education and their participation in the workforce, we see an inflated degree of support over the telephone. So we have Afghans who over the phone are extremely supportive, extremely optimistic about women's rights. When we ask the same question in person, we see percentages that are around 20 to 25% lower. We see a similar pattern with corruption. Afghans over the phone tend to be more concerned about corruption. They're certainly also concerned in person, however, there is that variance. There's also more concern about their economic situation over the phone than they are in person. We see very minor differences in other aspects. For example, the optimism for peace is consistent with our in-person survey. Concerns about security are also consistent. Experiences of violence and crime, as I've shown you, are also quite consistent. The rating of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, whether they're honest and fair, whether they're efficient, whether they're good at arresting criminals, that's all consistent with the data that we collect in person. On demographics, we are seeing the need for closer analysis. So at the national level, for example, support might be more that support for certain policy might be a certain percent. But when you look at that across gender, across age, education, or income, you see notable differences. So a lot of the breakdowns that I've showed, or the majority of the breakdowns that I've shown, we're able to tease that out. However, there is more that can be done with that data. That also speaks to the importance of looking beyond the national level data and sort of interrogating at the with the various demographics. The regional differences that I pointed out are also interesting, especially when we look at peace, sense of representation. We also see that there's no differences when we look at the deteriorating economic impact. It's just consistently across the country, Afghans are reporting a worsening financial situation, worsening economic situation, and so on. So where we are right now is we've collected the Wave 2 data, as Abdullah mentioned earlier. At present, we are just finishing up the analysis and our embargoed presentations to donors. We do hope to have that data available for public release within the next 2 months. We're happy to share it in any platform that may be requested. Wave 3 of the data has also just, it will wrap up within the next 2 weeks. What's interesting about Wave 2 data is that we've managed to contact almost half of the same respondents that we did in Wave 1. So Wave 2 data could essentially be interrogated as panel data, where we've talked to the same person now twice. So the differences that you see at the individual level from September to December are quite interesting. Wave 3, we're still waiting to complete the field work, so we'll be able to determine in a few weeks whether or not we'll have a panel data set there. But this was, I may have exceeded my time limit, and I think I've also taken some of Abdullah's time. So thank you very much, everyone, for any questions that you might have in advance. And I look forward to discussing these findings with you or answering any other questions that you might have.
very much, Dr. Akseer, and thank you very much, Mr. Ahmadzai. So we are running a little bit tight on time, but this has been a very rich presentation of quite nuanced data on current perceptions of the Afghan public about their conditions, as well as about their priorities for peace talks between the government and the Taliban. I thank you very much for triangulating at the end or comparing the results from your flash surveys to your annual surveys. I think many of us will want to come back to some of the consistencies and inconsistencies that you've observed. On that note, Dr. Akseer, you'll see that there are a few questions in the Q's and A's that a few participants have sent to you. I fielded them temporarily, but you may want to look at them and provide the answers that the participants are hoping for. And finally, thank you for agreeing or offering to share your slides at some point with us. Perhaps my colleagues, Dr. Banerjee and Dr. Bojic we can think about whether we might post that on CIPS's site or make it more widely available when the Asia Foundation is ready to do so. Okay, so without further ado, I'll pass the virtual microphone to Dr. Saeed Parto of APRO.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, NEPA, for organizing this, and thank you for colleagues from Asia Foundation and the great presentation. I will now attempt to share my screen with you to get my presentation started, and I will try to be brief. Good afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Saeed Parto from Afghanistan Public Policy Research Organization, also APRO Europe and National Advocacy Committee for Public Policy. This is a description of who we are and what we do. At APRO, we do applied research and monitoring of various things, including fundamental rights and evaluations for other people's projects and programs. APRO Europe is a platform for us to share that information and do high-level advocacy with international donors based in Brussels. And National Advocacy Committee is a network organization. It is not registered, and it's about 85 organizations that work in various areas from an advocacy perspective based on evidence in public health, education, access to justice, gender equality, food security, and anti-corruption. APRO was one of the founding organizations and acts currently as the secretariat for NACPP. The forums that Stephen mentioned, the open forums for peace, they were actually through NACPP, but facilitated by APRO. It is fair to say that Afghanistan's peace process to date is widely viewed as dysfunctional, insufficiently inclusive, unrepresentative, and as far as tracks of diplomacy go for peace process, represents an incomplete track one, the highest level of consultation and negotiation that could occur. There is, in addition, an absence of effective mobilization for peace by civil society at the subnational and national levels. There is an absence of strategic direction from international donors on an inclusive peace process based on representation. There has been an overemphasis of intra-Afghanness of the process that let Afghans sort it out for themselves without too much direction being provided, or guidance, or support, or opinions. Regardless of all of these, everyone would also agree, particularly Afghans who have gone through hell and high water for the last 40 years, that the agreement between the US and the Taliban holds some promise for some degree of peacefulness in the country. There is an impetus and there's an opportunity. And our efforts as an NGO in Afghanistan and outside as much as we can is to support that impulse and to add to it and to try to see where we can go with this opportunity that is not going to stay with us forever. The key characteristics of an inclusive peace process are as follows. They are typically, and this is based on experience elsewhere, They begin in secrecy. So the fact that the US spoke to the Taliban in and by itself is not a problem. It's what happened afterwards that raises a number of fundamental questions. So they begin with high-level discussions, typically behind the scenes. Inclusiveness in these negotiations, or even more inclusive negotiations, does not mean that 35 million people would be present at the negotiation table. It is done based on representation, based on elections at different levels using various mechanisms to select or elect people to represent their constituencies. In inclusive peace processes, there are multiple tracks of negotiation, popularly referred to as track one, which is the high level, which is what we seem to have quite a lot of at the moment, although it's incomplete. There's a track two diplomacy, which has representation from national actors, and they are there because of elections that have preceded their being nominated to attend and participate. And there's track three, which is at the lowest subnational level, at the community level, and they have representation in peace processes. If you assess, and I will describe this in more details later, if you assess the current peace situation, peace negotiation situation in Afghanistan, we will immediately see that track one is incomplete. It's only the Taliban and some conglomerate of Afghans from government and non-government entities, handpicked rather than elected. And track two and track three, despite claims from various segments of civil society, are currently effectively non-existent. For track one, the highest level of negotiation, what it would require, and this is again based on experience of peace negotiations, inclusive peace negotiations elsewhere, it would have to have representation from the government of Afghanistan. It would have to have representation from the Taliban. The United States, as a major actor in Afghanistan's situation, needs to be present. Multilateral agencies, UN and UNAMA in particular, but also the European Union, they need to have a presence. Neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran, whose dealings and views on Afghanistan have a major effect on what happens in Afghanistan, they somehow need to be accommodated. Other key actors such as the UK, Canada, the Nordic Plus countries, Russia, India, China, all have stakes in Afghanistan. There has to be a trace and element of the presence by these various actors. And last but not least, there has to be a presence and participation from spoilers of the peace process. Spoilers are not necessarily armed groups that go around and assassinate other people. Spoilers could be the actors who stand to benefit from the conditions of Afghanistan as it is today, mostly monetarily, but also based on some ideology. These spoilers need to be identified, need to be brought on board for a peace process if that peace process is to result in sustainable peace. Question we need to ask at the moment is, who are the actors present in the current peace negotiations in Doha? As far as we know, it's the Taliban, maybe not intermediaries, and some representatives from government and non-government entities in Afghanistan. The question related to that is, what are the degrees of influence on the process? How do they shape the process? Who has the upper hand in this process? What are the power relations? And evidence suggests that the Taliban have a huge sway over the process, and so far that sway has gone unchecked. The second question we can ask is, what are the possibilities for a role of intermediaries formally and effectively to be present at the highest level of negotiations in Doha to facilitate for green lines to be identified and for red lines to be negotiated over? Track two typically is non-state actors, and those who are from state authorities are represented as in personal capacity. For Afghanistan, a track two would mean NGOs, international NGOs, and rights-based organizations, including a number of women's rights organizations in Afghanistan. It would mean subnational government authorities in a personal capacity, subnational opposition authorities in a personal capacity. As we know, large swathes of the territory in Afghanistan are controlled by the Taliban. Subnational opposition group authorities are people in positions of authority from those areas. political parties, religious authorities, workers and business associations, media, and academia. Again, these categories of actors are consistent with what has happened with more inclusive and ultimately successful peace processes elsewhere. Question we need to ask regarding track 2 is, actually, is there a track 2 in Afghanistan? We know of late, some NGOs have claimed that they have initiated the track 2, but track 2 requires information sharing, it requires coordination, cooperation, and ultimately collaboration in an open and transparent manner to contribute to the total effort for peace. If there is a track 2, as some claim, to what degree does it influence track 1 negotiations? That's a question that needs to be answered. There have been some attempts to influence the Doha process by civil society organizations. The degree to which that has succeeded, or the degree to which those recommendations and demands have been taken on board, is currently unknown to us. Second question is, what needs to be done to institute an effective, all-inclusive, representative track 2 for Afghanistan's peace process? That is a million-dollar question. There are some ideas that are lurking around, but it does require input from multiple sources for it to take place and take shape. Track 3 typically is at the grassroots level. It's community to community. It's about basic things such as access to food, water, shelter, income, protection and safety, and the like, the things people experience on a daily basis. For Afghanistan, this requires, for us to know what's going on in different communities, we need to have representation from local community mosques. We need to have representation from community development councils, which are responsible for community level development and are supported by international donors. Local shuras and jirgas, which are the traditional forms of organization and conflict resolution. Student groups, youth groups, local businesses, local NGOs, particularly the ones that deliver basic services in health and education, but also in other areas, and local government officials from key sectors such as health, education, and justice, again in a personal capacity, not an official capacity. Question we need to ask here is there a track 3 in Afghanistan? And the answer is a resounding no. Even if we think there is, what is the degree of influence that it exercises on track 2 processes? And the second question is, what needs to be done to institute an effective track 3 for Afghanistan's peace process? By way of moving forward, given all the deficiencies of the current peace process, we need to aim, by we, I mean everyone, Afghans, non-Afghans, donors, NGOs, governmental authorities with a stake or interest in Afghanistan. It's the collective we need to be looking for delineated and complete tracks 1, 2, and 3 that would function as the all-encompassing inclusive mechanism for peace. Without having tracks 1, 2, and 3, there is really no mechanism to speak of within which agendas for peace could be contested, discussed, and agreed upon based on consensus to then be taken up to the higher level for consideration by those who hold power. A peace agreement resulting from these processes is likely to have a high degree of sustainability. Again, this is based on particularly the experience of Colombia and Northern Ireland. And even in those 2 cases, despite the completeness of the processes and having all these tracks, the peace agreement that has been achieved remains tenuous. That speaks to the seriousness of making it as inclusive as possible to make the reached agreement as sustainable as possible. In Afghanistan currently, no national NGO, us included, is in a position or has the means to meet this challenge alone. The processes need to be facilitated and resourced with strategic direction. That is to say, don't just give the NGOs money to go and do something about peace, provide the expertise and the direction that's needed to move toward peace. We have plenty of experience internationally. All the donors that assist Afghanistan have access to this expertise. We want that, we need that in Afghanistan. That has to be mainstreamed in any discussion about peace. This process needs to be supported by international donors and multilateral agencies and INGOs. And among those, I would list Asia Foundation. So this is an open invitation to Asia Foundation to sit with us and others like us who want to do more about the peace process in Afghanistan, but are currently tied down and unable to do so because of the manner in which arrangements for supporting work in relation to peace is inadequate. Picking on individual NGOs and supporting them to set up a mechanism or to take a set of recommendations to Doha does not equal having track 2 and track 3 for Afghanistan. Sorry for the abruptness of the presentation. I was aware of the time limits, and I just wanted to get it out as quickly as I could possibly do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parto, for being so restrained in the time you took to make your presentation. And thank you also for being so direct in a sense. It's been, I think, very useful for all of us to hear the first presentation on public perceptions and the varied public perceptions of current conditions and expectations from the peace process, and then in a sense, your reality check about what is actually happening in the peace process, who actually has a voice, and mostly who does not have a voice, and then what could be done about that. Thank you for ending on those positive, those constructive suggestions at the end. So we have almost an hour left for verbal questions and answers. I would invite the presenters to look at the Q's and A's that several participants have noted. I'll just mention a few of them, starting with the last one from Mazeh Khadaf. Thank you, Dr. Akseer and Mr. Ahmadzai, for an excellent presentation. Can you share your hunch on what the drivers might be for patterns in provincial level data across questions, i.e. Central Highlands versus the East seem to have similar patterns across few questions, etc. Can you also comment on what might explain longitudinal variation in provincial and regional trends of support for women's rights in your survey of the Afghan people? Okay, I'll just pick one arbitrarily, one other question. Some of my questions have disappeared from the beginning. Sorry, I'm unable to access, yes, here it is, here they are. So questions were raised also for the Asia Foundation about the research covering perhaps only the big cities, as the perception of COVID-19, access to information and practice has been very different in smaller provinces, rural and conflict areas. So question about how representative your data is about rural areas. And another methodological question, this time from Feroz Abedi. Hi, this is Feroz from Kabul. How did you bring equilibrium among provinces into your survey? You did a random dialing, but how did you understand this call or phone number, where it was based, so whether in Kabul or Herat, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'd invite Asia Foundation particularly to look at some of those questions, and I will, if Mr. Ahmadzai or Dr. Akseer have any quick responses to some of those questions now, that would be great. In the meantime, I would encourage participants to either write a few questions for Dr. Parto, also about the peace process, or to ask to pose your questions verbally. Okay, so Dr. Akseer and Mr. Ahmadzai, I will pass the mic back to you to respond to some of the methodological questions.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to some of our audience members for the wonderful questions. I'll go through the ones on the screen that I see here. I must say, Feroz Abili, I'm glad you caught the Tale of Two Cities reference on that last slide. I felt like a bit of a dork and I didn't think anybody would pick up on that, but I'm happy somebody did. Okay, so more serious question from Maseh Hadaf. Maseh, it's very nice that, thank you for the question, and it's nice to be in touch with you here. Maseh had contacted me some time ago about the surveys, so I'm happy you're able to find this platform. On the drivers for, and some of the drivers for some of the patterns at the provincial level for some of the questions. We're going to skip the provincial level and we're going to only think about regional level because the data is not statistically significant nor reliable at the provincial level. So the analyses that I shared, the breakdowns were all at the regional level, but regional level is often consistent with provincial. So for example, the East and Central Highlands, those regions are usually just fairly representative of Bamiyan or other provinces in the East. Some of the drivers for perceptions there, certainly liberal versus conservative attitudes, particularly towards women's role in society, women's access to education, women's ability to work outside of the home. Those types of attitudes are often they've been consistent over the years. There are some fluctuations that we have seen. We see with the survey of the Afghan people data that attitudes are more shifting towards more liberal on the whole at the national level. For example, we have a few questions in the survey of the Afghan people on how women should dress, or the legal age for men and women to marry. And we're finding that over the past 14, 15 years, we've been seeing people become more and more open to women dressing a little less conservatively. And by less conservatively, I mean instead of the full face burqa, just with the hijab, with just the with at least the face showing. So we're seeing these shifts in some respects towards more liberal attitudes towards women. Other drivers for change, education is quite significant. Some of the data, some of the trends that I shared have breakdowns by education level. So we see that the more population becomes educated, the more they are towards being open-minded, towards being more accepting. Ethnicity is also quite big. While I didn't share any ethnic breakdowns, that data is available. So, and oftentimes ethnicity is a proxy for region. So if you just go through the slides again, anytime you see, for example, Central Highlands, you kind of intuitively would know what ethnicity that region would represent, and the same with the East. So Maseh, I hope that responds to your question. There's another question from Jawed on the coverage. This question is very similar to Abiyadi's question as well, also on coverage. So the research does cover all 34 provinces. Although this is using RDD, the way we monitor this, because we don't know who's going to answer the phone. We don't know what province they're going to be in. We don't know if it'll be a man or if it'll be a woman. The way to monitor that, or the way to control that, is through active straight up monitoring. So halfway into field work, so once we collected about 2,000 interviews, we look at all of the demographics, or we look at the data by demographics. So if we find that we have significant number of people in Kabul and we don't have any respondents from Nangarhar or from Samangan, we will actively call people and speak to them only if they're from that area, that demographic, or that gender. So to give you a real example, was about 3/4 of the way into field work for wave 1, we realized that the sample was disproportionately skewed to women or to men. It still is somewhat skewed, but that's more reflective of cell phone ownership in Afghanistan, and that's consistent with a number of other studies done both in Afghanistan and other third world contexts, where there's there's a higher probability of men having the phone and being an owner of a phone than women. So anyway, the way we approached that was we called numbers and only engaged in an interview if the respondent who answered was of the demographic that we're looking for. So if the person who answered was a woman, we would talk to her. But if it was a male calling, he would take their number down, and a female enumerator would contact that phone number and then proceed with the interview. So that's active stratum monitoring, and that's what we did to ensure that we have representation in all 34 provinces, as close to a gender balance as possible, although there were some limitations. On the relationship, the question from Ed on the relationship between female labor market contribution, whether it's females participating in the labor market because of the lower household income, or if their participation is contributing to a lower household income, that's up for speculation. It's really hard to tell based on the data alone, unless you looked at other indicators. However, it's hard for us to tell, but you are able to access the data and look at other indicators and try to determine that on your own. If I were to speculate, I would say that it's mostly, it could be because of attitudes towards women in those areas being generally more open and more liberal. So when we looked at questions on women's support or participant support for women's engagement in the household, and participant support for engagement outside of the household, support for women in leadership positions, and support for women in different types of offices, we see that that support is higher in those areas where women are actually working. So in the Central Highlands, where women are more engaged in contributing to the household income, those are the same people who have more liberal attitudes towards women actually being able to work outside of the home. So once again, it's speculative, but based on the data that we have, I think that would be your call to make, based on however you want to look at the data. And I think there is another question on, I may have had all of the questions, or I can't see the other ones unless I go over here.
Shall we give you a break, Dr. Akseer, and bounce a few to Dr. Parto? Great, thank you. So, thank you for those additional explanations of your methodology and the representativity of your data, and the limits thereof also, as well as the underlying trends that your data reflects according to your interpretation. Dr. Parto, I have a few questions here for you. You may have seen them, but I'll read them out for everybody. So the first is from Farhad Jaweed. I run one of the largest health programs, women's rights organizations in Afghanistan, I suppose, which works 70% in Taliban and ISIS areas. Based on my experience, the negotiation should also be started in Afghanistan by moderators who can access both sides. There should be an incremental change strategy for Afghanistan peace to assure both sides. The main interest of all Afghans are peace. Okay, so one more, perhaps two more questions for Dr. Parto. This is from Andy Tamash, who says, what sort of influence does the CSO NGO sector have on the key actors controlling the negotiations process in Doha? Another quick question from Kalam Shahed. How does the government benefit from a peace process which considers ceding power to what it considers a hostile group? And finally, this question is directed at Dr. Akseer by the anonymous attendee, but I think that it's also intended for Dr. Parto. So I'll bounce it to him first. Question, it's clear that the enfranchisement of all actors in the peace process is key if peace is to be sustained in the long term. However, is this truly possible given the significant differences and in some cases pure contradictions between the ambitions of central stakeholders? Subsequently, should we place greater emphasis on driving a result from negotiations, i.e. less actors consulted, or on the ideal of ensuring that all views are listened to and acted upon? Okay, so there are more questions, but Dr. Parto, I'll bounce those to you first, and then we'll come back to some of the others.
All right, thank you, Stephen. I'll be quick in my answers to these questions. To Mr. Javed, I'm very grateful that you have listed this. There are numerous NGOs that provide basic services to many communities, a lot of which lie in areas under the control of the Taliban. And if we were to institute a truly inclusive track 3 community level consultation, these types of NGOs and groups are precisely the facilitators for a track 3 to be initiated in Afghanistan. To a very limited degree, we will be doing this, but our reach is limited, and hence my sort of open invitation to everybody with the intent and resources who can support this action should have an open dialogue at least about how to go about this and how to make this happen. So very useful and definitely something that needs to be worked with. The second question was from Kalam Shahed. How does the government benefit from a peace process which it considers ceding powers in hostile group? Typically in peace negotiation, I mean, you don't have a peace negotiation process if all sides have not accepted that none of the sides can actually win the conflict. So it's an assumption we make about the current peace negotiations that both the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan, and the US for that matter, have reached a point where there will be no absolute winner using military might. Who falls victim to this situation is the civilians, who are targeted either intentionally or unintentionally and suffer from the disagreement, armed disagreement between warring parties. The assumption is if we are at that state where no side sees a clear win of the situation, they would be willing to make compromises and making concessions to come to some degree or some agreement about cessation of hostilities at least. Question from the anonymous attendee. It's an open debate. You could impose a peace agreement solution onto a population such as Afghanistan's, which has many, many drivers of conflict that go beyond the last 40 years. For those issues to be resolved or at least recognized so that thought and resources are put into resolving them, we need to understand what these issues are. We cannot assume that peace is not going to happen and kind of leave it at that. We need to get to the lowest level possible, identify the root causes of the conflict, attempt to address them, and ground up in a ground up manner, resolve those conflicts at the higher level at their most pronounced form as they currently occur in Afghanistan. What effect I saw, what NGOs, what influence do they have on the proceedings in Doha? At the moment, very little. What, as far as I know, has happened so far is that a list, sort of a wish list is created by some NGOs and then submitted to the powers that be in Doha. What effect it has on the proceedings in Doha, I have very little indication of anything happening with those recommendations or demands that are put to the negotiators in Doha. There is a last question from Flora Leibish. In view of the absence of track 2 and 3 participation in peace talks, as well as the current other obstacles, how realistic is the survey? Well, survey question, this is for Asia Foundation. So I think I will stop there. I hope that I have answered the questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parto. If I may, I'd actually like to invite you to answer intuitively Ms. Flora Liebig's question, right? Because one of the really interesting things about this panel is this juxtaposition of the survey results with your analysis of the peace process and its degree of inclusivity. So what is your sense? Then I'll bounce it back to Dr. Akseer.
Sure. We have done a couple of surveys, the last one of which was perhaps a year and a half ago, and we looked at two questions: the peace process and the question of women in the peace process, and then the question of elections in whatever peace agreement that might result. And what we found while doing that, among the many questions that we asked, was actually what people thought about the possibility of having a peace. There's no question that everybody wants peace. There's no question that people are so desperate for peace that they're willing to give up on their most fundamental rights to get to peace, which is an indication of a very high degree of desperation and helplessness. So to initiate track 2 and track 3 in a situation like this, I am willing to bet on it being quite successful, because it would accommodate, at least it would create a space for a lot of these anxieties to be expressed, and for an opportunity for the experts in peace processes to guide these anxieties towards something constructive. People who want peace and who want to concede based on desperation, it is not perhaps the most reliable source of coming to a peace agreement. Those anxieties need to be comforted. Those desires need to be documented and addressed. And the only way you can truly and well and truly do that is through instituting track 3 and track 2 with direct connection and influence over the proceedings at track 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Partos. So Dr. Akseer or Mr. Ahmadzai, if you've been following the questions, you'll see that there's a question from Alauddin Zalma about the outcome of the survey. How much are the findings, how much will they help the government in making decisions towards the peace process? Have you got an opinion of the stakeholders on the findings prior to the release of the outcome report, et cetera? So if I can invite you to address that, right? So what, in a sense, about the social utility of your survey results, and then perhaps come back to Dr. Partos' invitation to the foundation to support its bid, its call for the institutionalization of a really inclusive approach at the track 2 level and at the track 3 level, in which he suggested the Asia Foundation had a role to play. So could you comment on those linkages between your surveys and practice, if you will?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the audience member for that question. I think with the outcome of the survey, our intention and the way we've designed this survey is so that it could be used as evidence for policymaking. We know that there is a gap in capacity of the Afghan government. So we do have a data analysis training program where we train the government on how to use statistical software to analyze not only our data, but their own data. So our hope is certainly there that this data set, in addition to the survey of the Afghan people data set, is being used to inform policymaking. Whether or not they are able to use it is not in our control. However, we do provide the tools necessary. On whether or not we have the opinion of stakeholders prior to releasing the outcome of the report, yes, we do. Before we launched the wave 1 of the survey, we did engage in embargoed presentations, not only for our donors, but also for the Afghan government. Their opinions in some of the questions, they were not surprised. Other questions were a bit surprising. Opinions were mixed. We're currently conducting embargoed presentations of our wave 2 data. As soon as we're complete with, as soon as we've completed that, we'll share wave 2 data as well. I can't really comment on their specific reactions to the peace process beyond just saying that there's the usual surprise with some of the findings, and perhaps not really surprised with other findings. I think there was another question on Flora's question on how realistic the 52% who are supportive of peace, and this is actually related to our wave 2 of findings. So interestingly, and this is one of the impetus for why we prefer to do flash surveys. So why sort of checking the pulse of the Afghans is a little more favorable rather than just doing an annual survey where once a year you kind of check in with them. With our flash surveys, we see fluctuations. So far as we're completing the analysis, we see drops in support. For example, with the 52% of respondents who are optimistic. We looked at the very same respondents again in December, and we found a significant decrease amongst the same respondents, a 10% decrease in optimism. So that again speaks to the fluctuations of perceptions. Perceptions will change on a daily basis. Measuring them once a year is not as accurate. However, measuring them at least every 6 weeks or even more frequently than that will give you a better, more richer insight into how Afghans actually feel about something. Wave 3 data, once we receive it, will also be quite interesting. We'll be able to track perceptions from September to December to March. And I think that will give you a better understanding of what that 54% really is, what those same people are thinking, whether they're thinking consistently or if they've changed their mind. And if they have changed their mind, why have they changed their mind, and have they changed their mind in other aspects? So I hope that helps answer the questions. Please let me know if there's anything that I've failed to address.
Sure, if I may, in that regard. So you've been collecting this data, this very rich data for years now. So you've seen different Afghans evolving perceptions to dynamics of war, peace, livelihoods, etc. Given that, and given your most recent survey results, what is your view about Dr. Parto's argument that, in fact, the peace process should be broadened? If this is going to be representative of different Afghans' aspirations and needs, that it should not include them just in a theoretical way, but that it should actually include representatives of those different groups at the track 2 level, and then even more broadly at the local level, at the community level, through track 3 processes. And his argument, this should be institutionalized. So do your surveys provide any support for that notion? And even if they don't, what is your view as an important stakeholder in Afghanistan?
I think that our data certainly provides an interesting angle. For example, when we ask respondents whether or not they feel represented in peace talks, almost half of the respondents say that they do. And these are respondents who said not only in September, but also again in December that they feel represented. When we look at our survey of the Afghan people, we get consistent responses. We get more than half of people in the latest 2019 survey was of over 17,000 Afghans. So out of the 17,000 Afghans that we spoke with, more than half said that they felt represented. So I think in terms of maybe the Afghans that we're speaking with, there is that sense of representation. And of course, when you break that down by region, education, or any other demographics, there are certainly differences. However, being the ability to say that more than half of Afghans say that they feel represented does have some, it does have some weight to it.
I think so. And just to add to Dr. Akseer's point about representation, let me just give you a glimpse of, how the peace process between the year 1990 and 1992, from the communist regime to the Mujahideen, took place. Those days, I was in Kabul, and I'm pretty sure a lot of our colleagues were also observing. Peace process took place in a way where public input or public awareness about it was to its lowest point. People outside the inner circle that were negotiating a settlement were unwilling or unprepared to share the details with the public. Now, we are at a stage that people are at least aware of how this process is unfolding, who the negotiation team members are, what the differences are between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and what are the red lines for Afghans that they will not provide any concessions over. So overall, we see a much better structured process compared to the 90s in Afghanistan, but obviously with any process, there is room for improvement. The fact that civil society is able to raise their voice and they're heard, I think that's a major accomplishment for Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmadzai, for placing the current process in an historical context, comparing it to the previous peace process that your country experienced almost 30 years ago now. Dr. Parto, what do you think of this, the idea that according to the Asia Foundation's surveys, at least half or more Afghans feel represented in the peace process such as it is? Do you think that the improvements in transparency that have taken place compared to the early 1990s are sufficient to get the country to where it aspires to be, to reach its potential of a sustainable peace?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. There is, I think everybody agrees, a marked difference between perceptions of inclusion and actual inclusion. And I guess where I differ in my analysis with Asia Foundations is over that. Perceptions change, perceptions are important, but the actual situation on the ground, particularly when we have the peace process under a microscope and we know exactly who everybody is and what they are supposed to represent, we can say with some degree of certainty, compared to track one experiences elsewhere, that track one of Afghanistan's peace process is incomplete. And because it is incomplete, the likelihood of an agreement holding after the negotiations are over are lessened. It doesn't mean that it will not hold. The probability of it maintaining itself beyond the process of the negotiations is quite low. Inclusion in actual forms, in identifiable forms, as described through track 3, track 2, and track 1, would increase that possibility of an agreement being maintained over the longer term. Again, based on experience from elsewhere. So I have absolutely no disagreement about the perception of Afghans feeling they're represented. They probably see somebody from their region or ethnic background, and they are comforted that their people are present at the table. But that does not equal inclusion. That does not amount to a complete track 1 negotiation process.
Well, thank you very much. If I may, since Dr. Pato, you've alluded to other international experiences, if I may draw on some of my own experiences in that regard, I was privileged to be a fly on the wall, so to speak, during the peace negotiations in Guatemala in the early to mid 1990s, which led to a comprehensive set of peace accords. And the way civil society in its broadest sense, from indigenous people, women's sector, religious sector, human rights, business, etc., were brought into these negotiations was through an assembly of civil society that actually had input into every single agreement negotiated between the government and the guerrillas through UN mediation. Nothing got approved without civil society input early on, throughout, and at the end. Guatemala is still at peace, but sadly, the most far-reaching or transformative parts of those peace accords, such as redistributive economic reforms, to address the root causes of the war, which were partly based in discrimination and inequality and violence, were not implemented due to elite resistance. In Colombia in 2016, it is true, there was immense multi-sectoral civil society participation in at the margins of feeding into the Havana peace negotiations, which were essentially between the governments and the guerrilla with international mediation. Yet, the population, the majority of the population, I think 50.5%, actually rejected the peace accords through a referendum when they were put to the people in October 2016. They were only approved when a slightly modified package was put through the Congress, and there it was approved and so on. But the implementation of the accords remains very contested, including by the current government elected since 2018 in Colombia. What am I getting at here? I'm getting at, I would say that based on my limited experience, that it is that civil society and business and so on, and diverse civil society involvement is in fact important at the national level and at the subnational level, but sadly it's not a panacea. It's not a panacea. And in fact, even if there's vibrant involvement of organized civil society, that may not reflect public perceptions always, right? So hence the importance of surveys, but also of direct involvement of organized civil society, it would seem to me. Anyways. I'll open up perhaps to one more round of discussion on this connection between peace process, civil society participation, and surveys, public perception surveys. And then there are a few other questions that are appearing in the Q's and A's that will bounce back to the presenters. So, Dr. Parto, would you like to come back on this fundamental issue of types of civil society plus participation at different levels in peace processes? What might work, please?
Certainly. I fully agree there's no panacea for applying the formula and then expecting the solid result at the end of it. We can only speak in terms of likelihoods and the conditions that are conducive to generating an outcome that we would hope to get. What other experiences tell us, including the ones you have listed, is that, for example, in the current peace negotiations in Afghanistan, there's not even an agenda of the main points that the negotiating teams are supposed to be discussing and debating. Nothing has been said about poverty. Nothing has been said about the regional situation of Afghanistan, strategically and otherwise. Nothing has been said about its relationship with its immediate neighbors, Iran and Pakistan. Nothing has been said explicitly and definitively about the rights of women, arguably a major part of Afghanistan's affairs since 2001. Nothing has been said in a meaningful way about elections under the new regime post-peace agreement. Will there be elections? Will it be an emirate? We know what people think about these things, but the discussion in the current peace process has not included these fundamental topics to be resolved and debated. At least, even if they don't result in a peace agreement, they deserve to be debated. A full peace process has to address these issues. Otherwise, you have said those other inclusive peace processes are vulnerable or tenuous or haven't succeeded. I think the current peace process in Afghanistan is guaranteed to fail because it does not have these provisions. It has not created a space for debate to come up with what resembles an agenda for peace.
Sorry, thank you. I just unmuted myself. That's very compelling, Dr. Parto. Asia Foundation, Mr. Ahmadzai or Dr. Akseer, would you like to come back to this big set of issues linking public perceptions and the degree of inclusivity of the peace process and then its sustainability in the future?
Well, I think peace processes are fragile in environments where there is active conflict and there is not even an agreement for a reduction of violence or ceasefire. Obviously, in typical scenarios, successful peace processes begin with both sides coming together in agreeing on a set of rules. And reduction in violence or ceasefire is the starting point of that. Just echoing what Dr. Parthav said about, the process guaranteed to fail, I would drag that a little further by saying that maybe we are at a very early stage of a process that has not yet unfolded into meaningful negotiations that could actually then unpack all those issues with regards to the basic rights, women's rights, elections, what kind of political system there might be. But the first and most challenging part of it is for the two sides to sit together and at least agree on a set of rules and also the parameters for the negotiations. That's where I think progress or lack thereof could be expected. We are at this stage not in a position to conclude one way or the other whether the process may fail or succeed, simply because the two sides have not had those substantive negotiations on particular issues that matter to every single Afghan citizen. So for me, again, I see this as a positive sign that Dr. Parthav, the likes of him, and civil society organizations, women's rights activists are able to not only sit around the table with the Taliban representatives, but also raise their concerns in voice when when no one is listening to them. So that's what I see as a starting point. At this stage, I would not jump to a conclusion about whether this process will succeed or fail, simply because it's at its nascent stage. That's where things are. So we're still learning. And part of our studies is basically to see how the people view this process. Now, in September, when the data collection for wave one of our flash surveys was conducted, there was a big campaign in raising expectations that ceasefire will take place, peace will come to Afghanistan. We saw advertisements everywhere on TV, and people were hopeful. So with the start of negotiations, during our fieldwork, people were expecting reduction in violence. People were expecting these two sides to start the negotiation process. People were expecting a ceasefire. Did it happen? Well, the answer is no. Violence were really sustained at their previous levels, or in some cases, they increased in some cities, including these targeted attacks that are taking place in Kabul. So after the violence started, even despite negotiations taking place, in wave two, we are capturing a different pulse of the people, which we would love to share with you once the analysis is completed. But there is a significant difference between how people felt about peace process in September compared to how they feel about it in November or December.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmadzai. Thanks for this very interesting suggestion that this is still early days for the peace process. I think that's entirely compatible, as I hear it, with Dr. Parthav's recommendation that, in fact, this is the time for the peace process to be broadened in terms of including a much larger number of stakeholders in an institutionalized ways, but also of addressing other topics, certainly being more transparent about the agenda of issues that is being negotiated in Doha, and then eventually addressing root causes issues too. like poverty and inequality and discrimination and so on. So we have, in that regard, I'd just like to read two comments in the Q's and A's, both from Farhad Jaweed, one saying track 1, 2, and 3 can be connected and can move at the same time if civil society connects with the Afghan government and Taliban through grassroots diplomacy. And then he goes on to say, as a volunteer, I can help make the connection in 19 provinces and get the process started between the two sides if the opportunity is provided. So there is an offer of support and engagement for building this track 3 level in 19 provinces. For Dr. Parto and his coalition, his network, and many others to perhaps explore more fully. Let me, as you're reflecting on that, I think there was one greater emphasis. Yes, I thought that there had been some methodological questions that hadn't been answered. I can't find them, but Dr. Akseer, please stand by for those. I see another question for Dr. Parto, this time from Atik Rahimi. Request for more active civil society participation in the peace process has been made by Afghan government negotiators, by the team. How is civil society and national and subnational level, how can they be mobilized? How are they mobilizing, or can they be mobilized to respond to this invitation? Okay, so with that, I will pass the microphone over to Dr. Parto.
Thank you. I am thinking. It's very, I'm actually quite pleased and moved by Mr. Jaweed's offer of working with us in attempting to do what we feel very strongly needs to be done. Yes, I think, if I may, Stephen and Nipa, if we could, our details could be exchanged so we can get in touch with Mr. Jaweed to see what's possible, what's feasible to do. I'm very happy to do that. As far as the question from Mr. Rahimi, it's great that the government, and actually the current, the government under President Ashraf Ghani has been quite accommodating of civil society organizations. That needs to be stated. The degree to which input from civil society has been utilized by the government is another discussion, but the invitation has been open and has always been there. The fact that government has now come out and said that they want input from civil society, that's an absolutely positive signal for us to actually even become more serious about our desire and collective efforts to institute something that resembles the track 2 and track 3 in Afghanistan. By whatever means necessary, of course, all peaceful means to be utilized. Voluntarily, without resource, in-kind contribution, really anything to add to the momentum of the current peace process and to make something of it, rather than look back in a year or something and say that was a missed opportunity. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of impetus. I firmly believe, we firmly believe as an organization, it's still there. The expectation and hope for peace is very much there. And it's time to react to it and to contribute to it by doing these extracurricular activities, voluntarily or otherwise, to resemble track 2 and track 3.
Thank you, Dr. Parto. Would the Asia Foundation like to come in on these issues?
Thank you, Stephen, for the chance to reflect and comment. To be quite honest, I don't think we can speak any further beyond our survey or methodology and the work that the TAF Afghanistan office is doing. Anything beyond that would just be speculation.
I thank the audience for attending and participating in today's not only stimulating but also very utilitarian dialogue on the peace process. I haven't seen too many of these types of, particularly on public perception and civil society's involvement in the peace process, not too many. But so this has been very useful, and we can continue talking about these things through blogs in our CIPS newsletter. Saeed has already contributed a blog, and I understand that Abdullah and Tabasum are interested in submitting a blog as well. So we will continue this discussion, and it would be very useful for people interested, and also, Stephen could join in. By the way, Stephen, we didn't do the blog on the first seminar that we have, webinar that we have. Okay.
Work in progress.
Okay. And my heartfelt thanks to Abdullah and Tabasum of Asia Foundation and Saeed of APRO for their thoughtful presentations and participation in the discussion session. I thank Kim McKay of the Asia Foundation office in Washington, D.C. for being a strong supporter in the organization of today's webinar. Thank you, Kim. Kim and today's panelists are our longtime partners, helping us to build a knowledge base on Afghanistan in our students and the university community with their annual visits to our campus. We hope to strengthen these partnerships. I thank my university colleague, Anna Bozic and Michael for the help in organizing this webinar. Well, I'm useless in technical issues and they have helped me. I need further help also. And a big thanks to Stephen, whose leadership enlivened our session. It was really good. I thought of getting you because everybody, a person can chair, but cannot stimulate discussion oftentimes. And this time, with your help, we got into issues and got insights which are not always there. Thank you very much. Big thanks. And you can get in touch with me with my, or Stephen. Stephen doesn't get directly involved in Afghanistan issues, but he is there with us as well. And the email, maybe I can send in the emails to Anna. Is it possible to send the email message, like, my email to the audience of today through the—
Absolutely, yes. Yes, we can do that. And I'll also contact all the members audience members who attended today with the link to the video.
Okay. Stephen?
Yes, so just on that point, perhaps if the presenters are willing to share their slides, yes. We can, as I said, CIPS, we can explore whether it might be possible to post them. But in any case, to all the participants, remember that both the Asia Foundation and APRO have excellent websites, and we encourage you to go there to see their past reports, their current reports, and forthcoming reports, both on public perceptions as they are evolving month by month, as Dr. Akseer indicated, but also as the practices of civil society inclusion perhaps evolve too in Afghanistan over the next months and years. So Asia Foundation and APRO websites are the go-to places, without, of course, forgetting us at CIPS in Ottawa.
Right. Thank you very much. So we will close our session now. Again, thanking the audience as well as the panelists and Stephen.
Thank you, Nipa, for being our leader in all of this, for pulling all of these people and these elements together. All the best to everyone.